Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual program at the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Lenny Mendonca. I'm the former Chief Economic and Business Advisor to the state of California and a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Directors. I'm excited to be moderating today's program here with you virtually. While it is virtual today, the club has begun in-person programs at our beautiful San Francisco headquarters. And to learn more, visit the club's website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by David Wessel to discuss his newest work, Only the Rich Can Play: How Washington Works in the New Gilded Age. The book follows the Opportunity Zone initiative to see who profited from the plan that was supposed to spur development of blighted areas and help people out of poverty, among other groundbreaking topics. The book describes the creation of that massive tax break in which political and economic elites attend to the care and feeding of the super rich, and by David's accounting, helped increase rather than decrease inequality. We'll be discussing a lot in the next hour. I will start with questions, but I want to hear your questions too. If you're watching along with us, please put your questions in the text chat on YouTube, and we'll be getting to them later in the program. Thank you, David, for joining us today. Wish we were in person in San Francisco, but it's a delight to talk to you in Washington.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be with you this way anyways.
Well, I love the view from your room and the book in the background. So, David, let's start with a little bit of context. Why, you've written New York Times bestsellers on important topics before. Why write this book? What was the impetus for writing about opportunity zones?
Well, I left the Wall Street Journal 7 or 8 years ago, and I have a job at the Brookings Institution that I largely describe as being a orchestra conductor. And I was getting a little tired of that, and so I decided to try something. I was in the market for something different. And one of my colleagues, an economist named Adam Looney, who used to be in the Obama Treasury, came into my office one day. And Adam is one of these guys who just it's his thing to find things that are in tax bills and call attention to them sometimes without much approval. And he mentioned this to me, and I thought it was kind of interesting because I was always intrigued by ways we could use public policy to help left behind neighborhoods. And then he mentioned that Sean Parker of Napster and Facebook fame, the guy who Justin Timberlake played in the movie Social Network, was involved. And suddenly I thought, wow, this might be a story, a really good story, a good narrative, not just a white paper on the tax provision. So that's how I got interested in it. In the spring of 2019, I heard that there was an Opportunity Zone Expo at the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino in Las Vegas. And I thought to myself, I'm not sure I'm going to do a book, but if I do a book, I'll regret it if I didn't go there. So I went to this convention of people. Some had money and were looking for ways to reduce their taxes. Some were looking to be middlemen. Some were trying to raise money. And it was literally like what I imagine a modern day gold rush to be. And the people were so interesting and so open about their plans and their incentives that's the moment I decided there had to be a story here. I thought it was going to allow me to travel around the country a lot. Unfortunately, because of COVID, I didn't make it much beyond Portland, Oregon, but I did learn a lot about the country, and I think it turned out to be a really interesting story.
So let's go back to the beginning just for a little context for our listeners. So we're talking about opportunity zones as the core element of the tax code that you described. Can you tell us a little bit about what those are for those who aren't familiar with them?
Sure. So for a long time, going back to the days of Jack Kemp, the Republican congressman and HUD secretary in the 80s, Washington has looked for ways to write provisions in the tax code that get rich people to put money into neighborhoods that need money. Jack Kemp's were called enterprise zones. They actually never got enacted into law, but there have been a series of provisions like that along the way The most recent is called the New Market Tax Credit. This one is somewhat different. And the way this works is if you have capital gains, that is, if you're sitting on profits on some stock or property you bought, and you sell that property, you're allowed to defer and reduce the capital gains tax you owe on that profit if you invest it in an opportunity zone fund. And then whatever, you do have to pay that tax eventually, but you get to defer it, and paying taxes later is always better than paying sooner, and you get a discount. But the most important thing is if you put money into an opportunity zone fund and you hold it for 10 years, then you don't have to pay any capital gains taxes whatsoever on the profits from that investment.
And so that sounds like a pretty interesting tax incentive, but it's not available everywhere in the country, right? It was only if they're particular places.
Right. So the law said that gave some criteria for opportunity zones. And it said that the way the criteria worked, 56% of all the census tracts in America were eligible. But then it told the governors, and this is kind of an interesting feature of opportunity zones, that you can pick up to 25% of the eligible zones in your state to be opportunity zones to get this favorable tax treatment. Some governors did an open process, and it was very wisely done. I know in California, I think the state, you would know this better than me, Lenny, actually published the list of zones they were considering, and there were a few that didn't belong there, so they took them off, like the Stanford campus. Some governors were foolish. They didn't have much time to do this, and there was not much advance warning. This provision didn't get a lot of airing as the tax bill was being written. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was huge, and it mostly dealt with corporate taxes, and so people weren't paying attention. And in some cases, as you might suspect, being a cynical reporter, there was a little bit of corruption at the state capitol level. So we have overall 8,764 opportunity zones across the country. They are on average poorer than other census tracts, but some of them really aren't that poor, and some of them have gentrified a lot or drawn a lot of investment even before the law was passed. So, for instance, in Texas, the city of Austin asked for 4 zones. The governor gave them 21. And Austin is one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country. They really don't need any help. In New York State, Governor Andrew Cuomo's office designated 25% of all the opportunity zones in New York State in Brooklyn, another place that is drawing lots of money. But the governors had a tough choice to make, because if you only pick the really worst neighborhoods in your state to be opportunity zones, and neighboring states make a different choice, you're not going to get very much money. You might feel good that we designated these really poor neighborhoods, but people aren't going to do that. And so it was a challenge to governors. And I think what we've seen across the country, unfortunately, is the money flowed to the best off zones. The only data we have, and there's not much for reasons we can go into, is from a Joint Tax Committee of Congress working paper. Sorry about this. Working paper that says that 84% of the zones got no money at all, and half the money went to 1% of the zones.
Wow. So sounds like a proposal that is complicated and pretty quickly implemented. So how did this happen? What was the origin story?
So, in some respects it's complicated, in some respects it isn't. So I mentioned the New Market Tax Credit. So the New Market Tax Credit is complicated for people to use, but partly because there's a limit on how much money can go into New Market Tax Credits, and the Treasury has a role in vetting the people who get it. Opportunity zones, there's no limit to how many people can play, and there's no vetting of the projects. So how did this happen? Well, that's really the fun part here. Sean Parker, like a lot of people in Silicon Valley, thinks he has a better idea for how to do public policy than the people in Washington. It's just another way to hack into the system. It's just a political hack rather than the other kind. And he saw this across the country and indeed around the world, a lot of places that needed capital, and he and a lot of his peers had a lot of money. So he had this idea that we ought to be able to use the tax code to do this. And he went about this in an unusual way that proves extraordinarily successful. Instead of going on the speaking circuit and putting this thing out there in public, he talked to a lot of people and eventually founded a think tank in Washington, the Economic Innovation Group, to help promote this into law. And he was aware of what he was good at and what he isn't good at. So he hired two guys to work with him, a guy named Steve Glickman, a Democrat who'd been a Senate staffer, came from the Obama White House, and John Lettieri, a Republican, who'd been a Republican Senate staffer and later at an organization that lobbies for U.S. Units of foreign multinationals. And he basically told them, you figure out how to do this. And for 2 years, they did basically nothing except get ready. It was a stealth thing, which is unusual in Washington, I guess not so unusual in software development. And they very carefully and smartly built a case that we have a problem with geographic inequality in the United States. There had been a lot of talk about income inequality, rich versus poor, not quite so much about the differences between communities that were prospering and those that are not. And so they initially didn't talk a lot about opportunity zones or a tax break. In fact, they barely mentioned it. Instead, what they did was they laid the foundation that we have a problem for which, lo and behold, they had a solution. When they were ready to go public, they did a very good job of recruiting a bipartisan group of sponsors, notably Cory Booker, the Democrat from New Jersey, and Tim Scott, who proves instrumental, the Republican from South Carolina. So although this got put in the Trump tax bill and has been labeled a Trump proposal, they actually, beginning in 2016, had built this bipartisan coalition. And I think the reason they were successful was, in addition to the fact that they had made the case that we have a geographic inequality problem in the United States, is that the talking points are pretty appealing. And most of the people who signed on to it thought, well, if Cory Booker's for it and Tim Scott's for it, and the EIG got a Republican economist, Kevin Hassett, later in the Trump administration, and Jared Bernstein, a Democrat, now in the Biden administration, to bless it. It just seemed like motherhood and apple pie. Democrats and Republicans are for it, and will get money to poor neighborhoods, and they didn't really pay attention to the details.
Interesting. One of the things I enjoyed about your book, for those of you listening along, is a very interesting tax topic and policy question, but you bring it to life with the stories about how all this happened. And you drew me in right when you start with the opening story about it sounds like a wine-laden dinner at the Blue Duck Tavern, which, by the way, is one of my favorite restaurants in Washington. But so can you recount that story a little bit just to bring this to life?
Sure. So the book opens with a scene at the Blue Duck Tavern where Sean Parker's in town, and he was actually involved in lobbying members of Congress on this. But at this point, it's early on. He's having dinner with Jared Bernstein and Kevin Hassett, and they're talking about the thing. And Jared Bernstein tells me that the conversation was pretty wide-ranging. And at one point, Sean Parker started talking about his interest in finding a cure for cancer, which is one of his major philanthropic ventures. In fact, one that he's quite involved in. He spent a lot more money on that than on lobbying for opportunity zones. And as the conversation goes on, Jared tells me that Sean Parker says he has a cure for cancer. The good news is it costs a lot of money, and the good news is you have a 50-50 chance it'll kill you. And I think that it does convey something about Sean Parker. He is a kind of outside the box thinker, and that allowed him to think about ways to push a proposal in Washington that is very different than what, say, Mark Zuckerberg did when he tried to change the immigration laws, or even that Bill Gates has done. Hire some technicians. And then what made Parker different than some other CEOs is he really enjoyed going around and talking to members of Congress. John Lettieri, who at his old job spent a lot of time shepherding CEOs from big companies around Capitol Hill, says they all did it because they knew they had to, but they hated it. And Parker really enjoyed it, and he's a very engaging guy. And so after the staff had softened the ground a little bit, Sean Parker would come in and talk to members of Congress. Pat Tiberi, a Democrat from Ohio, tells me about it. And that made it even more appealing. But again, it was about the general idea and not the specifics. As you may know, or you probably do, Lenny, if you looked at the book, The Trump White House wasn't initially very enthusiastic about this. They had other priorities for the tax bill. But then came Charlottesville, that horrible demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia, between white nationalists and people who were protesting a Robert E. Lee statue. And as you may remember, the president said that he thought they were very fine people on both sides. That was one thing that really energized Tim Scott, who's African American, and he went very public at his criticism, condemnation, really, of Donald Trump. That led the White House to invite him to meet with the president one on one. And as Parker told me, and he recounts in his autobiography, he went with some trepidation, thinking that there was going to be a confrontation where he would have to explain to Trump why he was sounding like a racist. Um, so he turns out it was a very conciliatory conversation, and Trump did a lot of listening. And then at one point, Trump says to him, "What can I do to make it up to the people I've offended?" Well, Tim Scott was ready for this. He said, "You can support my Opportunity Zone proposal in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act." And like like that, the White House got behind the proposal. The next day on Air Force One, President Trump endorsed it. I don't think that's why it became law, but it certainly gave it a big boost in the Senate House negotiations.
And that sounds like for the magnitude of this idea, that sounds like an incredibly rapid and opportunistic, if you will, chance that it actually got through.
Absolutely. I mean, there are lots of, there's lots of hundreds, over 1,000 bills in Congress introduced every year. And this was introduced in 2016 as a bill. And like most bills, it was going nowhere. And it was only because Tim Scott was one of four senators who was instrumental in crafting the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 that it got in there at all. It wasn't in the House version of the bill. And it was only in the Senate version because of Tim Scott. And once they got it in the bill, they stopped talking about it. So there was no public notice, no discussion, very little vetting of it. In fact, it was so obscure that the first newspaper story in the New York Times reporting that it had become law didn't show up till a month after President Trump signed the bill in December 2017.
Wow. So, give me a little bit of perspective about why someone like Cory Booker or Jared Bernstein, who's a well respected economist on the left, would be excited about this. What was their, from a policy perspective or personally, why did they?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, Cory Booker was the mayor of Newark. And when he was the mayor of Newark, he was very active in trying to find ways to bring big companies to invest in the city. I mean, he basically said, look, Newark is right outside of New York City. Um, uh, we ought to be able to find a way to get some investment here. And he was they'd had a lot he got had some success in getting the state of New Jersey to create some tax incentives to get businesses to invest in Newark. Prudential was one of them, and it worked. But I think that he he forgot the lessons he learned there when this bill was designed. Because first of all, the land in Newark that was being used for these real estate projects was city owned, so the city had a lot of control over what went there. And secondly, there were some incentives to get businesses to hire, of which there are none in the Opportunity Zone bill. So I think he's a kind of that kind of a Democrat who's looking for a way to marry the interest of urban neighborhoods, urban areas with big companies and get business investment. So he kind of liked the idea. And I think he and Tim Scott also liked the idea that these two African American senators, um, both of whom had served in city and local governments, could come together on something. Their first joint bill was an apprenticeship bill, actually. Tim Scott comes from a totally different background. Cory Booker, although he lived in a housing project when he was mayor of Newark, comes from a well-off family. His parents were executives at IBM. Tim Scott grew up largely a single mom household, um, and through a series of mentors and drive, became a politician in South Carolina, a successful insurance salesman first, and then a politician in South Carolina. And he always had this really interesting mix of very strong views on questions of race and equity, but a very conservative view about economic policy. And as you can imagine, it's not so easy to be elected as a black politician in South Carolina. He he threaded that needle pretty well. But when he came to the House of Representatives, he was very much a Tea Party Republican. He voted to repeal the Affordable Care Acts, and he believes in cutting taxes and providing incentives for people to do things. So I think what they both had was a strong conviction that Washington needed to do things for localities that needed money, some faith that if you give people incentives, they'll do the right thing, and they also saw a chance to make a name for themselves by promoting something that was kind of unusual. And so Booker is still endorsing it, which has made it a lot harder for the Democrats to who want to repeal it. But Scott is really the one who got it into law.
Okay. And you talked a little bit about Sean Parker's role in this, but from your perspective and research on this, why was Sean Parker interested in this topic among all the other things that he could pay attention to?
Um, well, that's a good question. And I should say that Sean Parker told me that he has not personally taken advantage of this tax break. Um, so I don't think that people who think he was lining his own pocket are right. Um, it began when he was actually in Africa in Tanzania, and he started thinking about how much how much places poor countries in Africa needed, and how little foreign aid was going to fill the gap. And so his original idea was to do something around providing people incentives to put money overseas, but he was convinced that that was politically impractical. So I honestly think that Parker is one of these guys who thinks he has a better idea for doing things and wants to get it done. In cancer research, he was an early promoter of the idea that we could use immunology to fight cancer. So I think he's well intentioned. I think he was arrogant and naive. He didn't appreciate just how aggressive the tax avoidance community, the network of lawyers and accountants and real estate developers and wealth managers is at exploiting something like this. And I think he had too much confidence that if you provide incentives, most of the people will do the right thing rather than, as you know, I have in the book, build a Ritz-Carlton condo complex in Portland, Oregon, or self-storage facilities that don't employ anybody or so forth. And I think he also did not want to hear advice from people who said, you need to put more strings on this, more guardrails. Because he concluded, and did the people at EIG, that you put too many of these things on and you don't get any money. Jared Bernstein's a different case. I think Jared, who is a good Democrat, he's bought onto this idea that we can use the tax code to make to improve on the new markets tax credit and use the tax code to make this done. I don't think he was poorly intentioned, but I think he was wrong. And I also think that he and Kevin Hassett, they gave their imprimatur to this thing, and they did a white paper that talked about in general how it might work, but they didn't pay enough attention when the bill was written to stand up, or when the Trump administration promulgated regulations, to stand up and say this wasn't what we had in mind. So you have the EIG guys really good at taking advantage of the Booker Scott connection. Their website has a picture of Booker and Scott, and in the Bernstein Hassett thing to make it seem bipartisan. But in fact, none of those people were really involved in the arcane details that I think matter a lot.
Okay. For those of you who have joined since we started, we're speaking with David Wessel of the Brookings Institution, talking about his newest work, which you can see over his shoulder, called Only the Rich Can Play: How Washington Works in the New Gilded Age, which follows the Opportunity Zone initiative. So, David, in full disclosure, I was in the Newsom administration when in California, when these opportunity zones were first put into law. And you were right in terms of the amount of time that governors had to quickly promulgate which zones they were talking about. That was done under the Brown administration in California. But then it was left to the states to see what other, if any, implementation they wanted to do alongside of this. And I must say, when I first heard about it, I thought it was a tax scheme. And then when I read the legislation, it sounded like if it were properly implemented with some safeguards and things, it could be a pretty interesting opportunity to do in a bipartisan way what it sounds like, the original intent of Scott and Booker, Senator Scott and Booker, as well as Sean Parker, really was. But what happened? It's early. This hasn't been 10 years yet for the full implementation. But what's been happening?
Well, before I get to that, finish your thought. So, what happened in California?
So in California, California has a tax code that is very progressive, and among its elements are that capital gains taxes are treated as ordinary income. And so for this tax incentive to have the full benefit for California taxpayers, California would have needed to align its capital gains treatment for opportunity zone investments with the federal level. Otherwise, the gains would still be taxed as ordinary income in California. The governor proposed in his budget that they wanted to do that. They wanted to align it, but only for particular types of projects that were aligned with the priorities of the governor, particularly around affordable housing, green and climate investments, and real job creation in the neighborhoods that really needed it. And then finally, there was because there's very little, if any, disclosure requirements about what was actually going on, California was going to require disclosure of the investments and reporting on the results so that they could really see what was going on. That was in the governor's budget, but did not pass the legislature. It was intended to be introduced as subsequent bills, but California's legislature really didn't have any interest in providing further tax breaks and was skeptical that it would result in economic opportunity. So nothing happened in California. And so the net result is, if you're an opportunity zone investor in California, there's no other requirements or disclosures or limitations, but you still have to pay California capital gains tax on any gains.
Right. So, as you know, that's happened in some states. In the District of Columbia, where I live, in order to get the capital gains treatment, you have to be certified by the city government. And that has made it possible for them to steer some of the money, although I think some of it's still gone to projects that would have been done anyways, but they at least are projects that fit the spirit of the law. So I want to be clear about something. I think that opportunity zones are used in some places for their intended purposes, and I'll talk about one of those in a minute. The problem is there's no requirement that they do so. So when you have this free for all, and although Sean Parker thought of this a lot as a way to get people to invest in startup businesses rather than real estate, it was largely used as a real estate tax break. And real estate investors in general they want high return, low risk projects. Some of them are socially benefit minded, but most of them aren't. So you end up with a lot of money flowing, as I said earlier, to those opportunity zones that are the most appealing because they're already getting a lot of investment, and there's hotels and office buildings and self-storage facilities, or in one of the most frustrating things, luxury student rental housing in communities that qualified only because college students show up as having very little income on the Census Bureau's count. So I think that, as best I can tell, most of the money went to projects like that. There's a lot of projects in downtown Portland, Oregon, which at the time I was reporting there was a more appealing place than it may be right today. Very few projects in the gritty neighborhoods of Baltimore, which is what it was intended for. But when you look across the country, you can find examples of how it has been used for the desired purpose, and it kind of tells you what it might be if it had more guardrails or more oversight. One of them is in South LA, where an outfit called Sola Impact, started by a really interesting guy named Martin Wodo, who's a Nigerian immigrant who went to Wharton, worked in private equity, dabbled in real estate on the side, and then went into the business of affordable housing in South LA, buying small apartment buildings, renovating them, and then renting them mostly to people who have Section 8 federal housing vouchers. And he and his partner, Gray Lusk, raised some money the conventional way real estate people do, going around the country, getting people to invest, because real estate is often a attractive tax shelter, but they also got people who were interested in doing affordable housing. someone approached them and said, you should take advantage of this opportunity zone thing. And they said, forget that. We don't want to have anything to do with the government. It's just such a pain. Being in California is enough government already. We don't need Washington too. But eventually they were talked into it, and they managed to raise a lot more money, $115 million in 12 weeks, because they connected with a lot of people who suddenly had capital gains they wanted to take advantage of, and they convinced them that this would be a good return. So that is an example of what opportunity zones were meant to do. There's a very small project in Baltimore that I know a little bit about, really a set of bombed out row houses that a small developer is trying to renovate with opportunity zone money and 100 other tax breaks to replace them with small business shops on the first floor and housing on the second floor. His whole project is $5 million. That's less than the cost of one condo in Portland, Oregon. So I think what it demonstrates is that there is opportunity to use opportunity zones for the intended purpose, but the founders were so determined to not have a lot of rules and let the market go do what it wants so they could get a lot of money into opportunity zones, which may or may not have happened, that they neglected to make sure that it was steered to the kind of projects that they intended it to go for.
So, can you give us some examples of the kinds of projects that would not have been in their desired investment criteria that have actually happened? And
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, there's a hotel and condo, Ritz-Carlton hotel and condo project going up in downtown Portland that's funded with opportunity zone money. And there's another one in Portland, which is just a loophole, but people took advantage of it. It's the headquarters of Northwest Natural Gas. The building was built, financed, and fully leased to this public utility. But because it didn't yet have a certificate of occupancy, the investors could claim it was new investment. So opportunity zone investors came in after the fact, after it was already built, and managed to get a tax break for something that was already done. In Champaign, Urbana, Illinois, and Louisville, Kentucky, which are college towns, there's pretty high-end stuff going on in the student housing thing that it's nice for the students to live in, and it created some construction jobs, but it's not doing anything for the neighborhood there was. Interestingly, in Baltimore, the big opportunity zone project called Port Covington is a huge mini city with retail and offices, and it's a big project that is probably good for Baltimore, but it got $600 million of city subsidies, and it had $500 million of investment from Goldman Sachs, of Goldman Sachs' own money, before opportunity zones were already on the horizon. And then by some complicated ways, they managed to get designated as an opportunity zone. And then subsequent investors are getting opportunity zone money, opportunity zone investments there. But they get the benefit of investing and getting a tax break for something that already has $500 million of Goldman Sachs money in it. So it's not the one of your risky things like that. One more, there's a self-storage operation in Dillon, South Carolina. There's a number of entrepreneurs who figured out how to use this for self-storage. And I was kind of skeptical about this because, self-storage facilities, how many people do they employ? One or two people at the front gate? And so I asked the guy, how many people was he going to employ? And he said, none. It's completely automated. They don't even need a guy at the front door anymore. So those are some examples of things that I just don't think is what the program should be doing. And I don't think taxpayers should be subsidizing that stuff. If they're good deals, good. Real estate gets plenty of tax breaks already. It's not like we have a shortage of tax breaks for real estate in our tax code.
So somehow I don't think luxury condos in Ritz-Carlton in Portland or no employment places for people to store their junk in South Carolina were high priority national economic issues.
Right.
So just a reminder, we're having a conversation with David Wessel about his new book, Only the Rich Can Play, How Washington Works in the New Gilded Age. And certainly welcome your questions. If you're watching along on YouTube, go into the text chat and put your questions in. We'll get to those in just a few minutes here. So David, has the Has Congress or the Treasury done any reporting on, in a kind of way, a fact-based way about what's going on with these? Were there any requirements in the bill that they do that?
No. So I don't know if people in San Francisco are as familiar with the process in the Senate known as reconciliation that's now become a household word in Washington. Um, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed through this procedure called reconciliation, by which you only need a majority of the Senate, not 60 votes. But there's something called the Byrd Rule, and the Byrd Rule, named after the former senator, the late senator from West Virginia, says you can't have something in this bill if it doesn't touch taxes and spending. The Democrats knew they couldn't stop the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but they were looking for every opportunity to needle the Republicans. And so the provision in the bill that would have required reporting was stripped out. Um, uh, as a side note, Senator Bernie Sanders objected to the title of the bill, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, because that doesn't raise or spend money. So on the books of the United States, this bill is known as an act of reconciliation pursuant to budget resolution such and such. Um, the Treasury did eventually have a form that the people have to fill out, but but it's not clear how much of that information will ever be made public or available to researchers to compare zones that were chosen and those that weren't. As I mentioned, there were some economists at the Joint Committee on Taxation, which gets particular access to tax returns, and they got a look at about three-quarters of the tax returns filed in 2019 by these Opportunity Zone funds. And they found that, as I said, 84% of the zones got no money. Half the money went to 1% of the zones, and the average income of people who are claiming this exemption was $1.1 million. The Biden campaign promised to reform Opportunity Zones, but has done nothing. It's not in any of the bills that it are pending in Congress now, as far as I know, and they haven't done much on the regulatory side. People on both sides of the issue, fans and foes of Opportunity Zones, have proposed bills to require reporting. Some of it's a little complicated because if you tell people they have to report to the IRS, then that may never become public or available to researchers. On the other hand, if you write the provisions differently, then the Treasury would have to present a report to Congress saying how much money each Opportunity Zone got and for what. But none of those bills have gone anywhere, nor have bills. There are competing bills. Some that would make the program more generous, more Opportunity Zones, delay the date in which you have to pay taxes. Others would narrow the things, say you can't use it for football stadiums or for self-storage and stuff like that, and you can only do it for affordable housing. But none of them seem to be going anywhere at the moment. But the way Washington works, as I say in the book, is this thing popped into a reconciliation bill at the last minute. So there's always the possibility that at the last minute something will get slipped into the law that will change the rules. Although I don't see how they do reporting under reconciliation, which is the way the Democrats are doing business now.
So if you could, based upon what you've learned, wave a magic wand and put into that legislation, hold aside for a moment how it would actually get adopted, what would be on your list of things that they should include?
Well, I would revisit the designation of the zones. I don't think it would be fair to say that someone who had invested in a zone that didn't really need the tax break would get disqualified. But going forward, we ought to severely limit the zones that have already gentrified, that don't need the money. You could do that by setting some new strictures on what you need to do to be in an Opportunity Zone, or maybe give the governors some right to undo some zones and create some others. I would limit the purposes for which Opportunity Zone investments could be used. I would rule out student housing and self-storage. And I would, if I didn't require, and it's tough to know how much you want to require and how much you want to nudge, I would at least make the Opportunity Zone investments have to assert that they were doing something that they would only doing because of Opportunity Zones, and it would benefit the community. I would probably put some, in addition to reporting, some requirements that, or at least extra incentives to do some hiring. And I have a number of people have pointed out to me that while this is a lucrative capital gains tax break, it may not be lucrative enough to get you to put money in a really, 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 really bad community. So I am intrigued by the notion that you might have fewer zones, but you might have deeper incentives to invest in a really uh, poor neighborhood. Um, maybe, just to make it so that the money gives some incentive to steer the money into the places it should go. But I think that the problem here is that this is hard to do. And one of the lessons of this whole episode is maybe trying to write the tax code so you get rich people to do things that they don't want to do doesn't work very well. And the alternative, of course, is just raise their taxes and then the government can decide where the money goes. That's not, a lot of people don't like that idea. Um, so I think that it's important that we really learn a lot about how this works. So if we're going to change it, and I suspect it's more likely to be changed than repealed, that we can learn from the mistakes that were made here. And to be fair, Sean Parker says he always thought that they would have a chance to fine tune the thing. If you have software version 1.0, then you plan that it's going to be 2.0 and 3.0. It's never final. Unfortunately, in today's Washington, that doesn't happen. They couldn't even get what used to be called a technical corrections bill to fix some wording changes in the law or some definitions. So between the fact that Washington is so polarized and dysfunctional, and this program has become controversial, either you're for it or against it, makes it very hard to fine tune it in a way that would make it work better.
I know Brookings has written some on opportunity zones. Is EIG still engaged in these topics, and what do they think about how this is?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. So EIG has said all along that they think there should be some changes made to the law, including reporting, and they're now in favor of excluding some of the census tracts that were eligible. One little detail in the law that was not well conceived is that most of the opportunity zones are in neighborhoods that qualify, but the law said that if you were next to a neighborhood that qualified, you could also become part of it. They're called contiguous zones, and that led to some of the bad choices by governors. And so they're very much involved in trying to protect this program. After Trump lost the election, they told me that they didn't think the Treasury did a great job of writing the rules. They didn't say that at the time Trump was president. And then EIG has really matured beyond opportunity zones. They've done a number of different things. They have some plans for issuing visas for immigrants who are willing to live in neighborhoods, rural communities that are starved for people. They've been involved in lobbying against non-compete clauses in labor contracts, and they have some work going on how to build retirement funds for people who don't get retirement funds at work. So EIG has built on the success of opportunity zones and is doing other things, even though its original purpose was, as Sean Parker told me, to get opportunity zones into law, which they did extraordinarily successfully.
Okay. And as you said, some of this is driven by regulation promulgated by the Treasury. Is there any chance or any talk of any of this things that you're talking about, or some elements of what was a challenge with the Trump administration's regulation being done regulatorily, or is this going to have to go back to Congress?
I think both. Some things can't be fixed by the Treasury. Of course, one of the realities of Washington is that once you write regulations, if you want to change them, it's like writing them all over again. You have to, and so that's a long process. I think the Treasury has had a few other things that are higher on its agenda, so they haven't got to this. And I also think they know that this is like a political minefield because so many people, it has a strong constituency among many mayors and economic development people who want any tool they can possibly get. And it has strong criticism from people who see it as just another trickle down tax break for the rich. And so this hasn't done anything. My guess is that eventually the Treasury, if Biden gets around to it, will do some stuff. And eventually there will be some legislation, but I don't see it on the horizon anytime soon. As you know, there's plenty on the horizon here in Washington, and the fact that this didn't make the first train or the second train means it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Okay. So speaking of those trains that are rolling down the tracks, can I ask you a more general question about, since you're an acute observer of what actually is happening in Washington? So do you have any thoughts about what's going to happen in the reconciliation process, and how's the filibuster going to play into that?
The reason I hesitate is that predicting anything that involves Congress these days is dangerous, particularly when it's being recorded. People might remember what you said. But that said, I think in the end, the Democrats will realize that this is an opportunity they can't afford to blow. That if the differences between progressive and moderate Democrats uh, uh, persist and they don't get reconciliation, that's the bill that has a lot of social spending in it, human capital, and the physical infrastructure bill through, they will really have blown a historic opportunity. It's widely expected in Washington, rightly or wrongly, that the Republicans will take the House in November 2020. So they basically have a narrow window to get this agenda through. And if they fail, I think they'll learn that voters will conclude they couldn't do the job. It'll hurt the Biden presidency, and it'll hurt the Democrats' chance of holding on to the Senate. So as a result, I expect in the end that'll make it get done. But that said, the divisions. Oh, and I should mention that one of the reasons we got the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was because the Republicans were so embarrassed that they couldn't repeal the Affordable Care Act that they felt they had to get something done in 2017. So I think, and what I'm saying is every Democrat in Washington knows that. That said, bridging the gap seems pretty hard when people are dug in. And President Biden is proposing an extraordinarily ambitious agenda with only a few votes margin in the House and 50-50 Senate. And so it's really going to come down to some brass knuckle bargaining at the end. I think they'll get something. I think it'll be smaller than the $3.5 trillion that was proposed. I think they'll have to cut out some of the programs that were very popular. How much they can raise taxes remains to be seen. So my short answer is something, but I'm not sure what shape or size it'll be.
Okay. So, in addition to having conversations like this about the book, what else are you working on these days, David? What's keeping you excited about what's going on?
Well, that's a great question. So actually, this morning, our time, and tomorrow afternoon, we have a really interesting project going with some of my colleagues at Brookings to draw some lessons from the economic policy response to the pandemic so that we can answer the question when we have the next recession, which will surely come. What did we learn in this recession that we should um, keep in mind? So, for instance, the next recession probably, although one can only pray, won't be a pandemic. But we learned a lot of things. We learned that, for instance, it may be better just for the government to give people money. And even if some people don't get money, even if some people get money they don't really need, then to try and devise these programs that are so targeted and narrow that the money never goes out the door. The Treasury got a lot of money from Congress to give rental assistance to landlords and tenants, but because the Treasury had never done that before, and because it was complicated and there were all these rules and it all went through local governments, very little of the money actually went out the door in the first year of the pandemic. Whereas the $1,400 checks and importantly, the unemployment insurance money went out right away. So we're trying to draw some lessons, and one of the things that makes this so interesting is that that we have lots of data. We have more data in real time than we've ever had before. So like mortgage forbearance and dealing with state and local governments and stuff like that. We want to be able to help policymakers avoid making the wrong decision next time based on some misunderstanding of what happened this time. And separately, I run something called the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy. Uh, the Federal Reserve has really changed the way it thinks about its policy framework. Used to be they said we're going to aim for 2% inflation. And now they say, well, we want to aim for 2% inflation over time. But if we have a period of below 2% inflation, we'd like to follow it with a period of above 2% inflation. And they wrote this framework at a time when they were having trouble getting inflation up to 2%. Of course, they got their wish and then some, and now we have 5% inflation. So we're doing an event to look at how this new framework is working and whether how they're going to realize their ambitions. There's a really interesting change they made is to basically say we're not going to raise interest rates when unemployment is getting low just because it's getting low. We're only going to raise interest rates if unemployment is getting low, and we see that passing through to inflation. And as I said, they said that at a time when economic conditions were very different. So one of the roles of my center at Brookings is to keep an eye on the Federal Reserve and help make them accountable because they're an incredibly important force in our economy, but very poorly understood by many people and many members of Congress for that matter.
Those both sound really interesting. I mean, we're in the midst of a fiscal and monetary response that the country hasn't seen, especially with the pace and that it went out. And there's all kinds of natural experiments about different programs, different execution in different states that, there's a think tank's lifetime worth of work to be done there.
Right. And it's important to note that the big headline here, it worked. We shut down the economy for public health reasons. We had a very deep recession, but it was very short. So we've learned a lot about the power of fiscal and monetary policy to cushion the blows of a shock like a pandemic that will be useful in the future. I think people had become rather cynical about the ability of fiscal and monetary policy. And they didn't understand. It's, always hard to say, oh, it would have been worse if we hadn't done this. But in this case, I think it's pretty clear it would have been a lot worse if we hadn't done this.
Yeah, no question. In the beginning days of the pandemic, sitting in the governor's office trying to see what was going on and what might be able to be done about it, it could have been a lot worse, trust me, without substantial and fast federal action. It was bad. So as on another topic about what's going on today, what do you think the response from the federal government's reaction to the supply chain and port issues how is that affecting what's going on?
Well, that's huge. One of the reasons we have this burst of inflation is that there are these kinks in the supply chain. There's lots of different things going on. Semiconductors are different than I don't know, milk or something. But I think what happened is that people in business didn't expect demand to come back so quickly. So they ran down their inventories and now they're running into problems producing. There's lots of idiosyncratic things like going on. Factories in China shut because of COVID. So then there's backlogs. I don't actually think the government can do much about it in the short run except look concerned. I mean, Biden made a big stunt of saying we're going to get the Port of Los Angeles up 24/7, which I think might have been an exaggeration. And if the trucks don't show up 24/7, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that, and this is of great concern to the Fed, if we have price increases because of these bottlenecks that will go away when the bottlenecks are resolved, we don't want people to start expecting 5% inflation for the next 5 years, because that would really undo a lot of the progress we've made. So I think they'll do what they can. The most interesting supply shortage is workers. And on one hand, it's great that wages at the bottom are finally going up. I don't know about California, but in Washington, D.C., there's a help wanted sign in almost every window, as long as the business is actually occupying that space. And there's just a lot of people, millions of people who were working before the pandemic who have chosen to stay out of the labor force. And I think some of them made lifestyle choices. Some of them may be afraid of COVID. Some maybe it's childcare. I don't think we really know why. But unless we can draw those people back into the economy, it's going to be a real constraint on growth going forward. And so I think that's a big concern and a problem we don't really have a solution for.
It is a big issue. And uh, I actually have a piece coming out in the next day or so with Lord Tyson on that very
Oh,
topic.
good.
That's
Do you have the
complicated.
solution?
Pardon me?
Do you have all the solutions?
I have the problem statement. I tell you what, its solution is not. It is not about cutting unemployment benefits. The states who
Right.
cut unemployment benefits early had no substantial increase in employment relative to those who didn't. I think a part of it's all of the things you described. Plus, there are many who have chosen to exit the workforce and not reenter. Who that's a rational economic choice now, given
Right.
the cost of healthcare and their sense of COVID risk
Childcare,
for
yeah.
their child and other things. And so, we're going to have to address those issues, even today, let alone demography going forward, where we're going to have an aging workforce, or we're going to have this challenge of not enough workers. I mean, as you said, the fast food restaurants in my neighborhood are starting with $20 an hour and time
Right.
off, and they still can't get people.
Right. So presumably we're going to see where places can automate, they will automate. I think we've all been to grocery stores now, which have self checkouts and stuff like that. And that can increase productivity and actually be good for us. I think there's also going to be a lot of questions about the role of immigration. Like in construction, places like that have, or healthcare where they've relied on immigrants, the turn away from welcoming immigrants has really caused problems for employers that I don't think the people who were so hostile to immigration really understood.
Yeah, especially in-person services businesses that are going to be really hard to automate. We're going to have to do those. Plus,
Right.
create. The United States pays on average $500 per child. In OECD, it's 14,000. So we're in a very
Wow.
different social construct than most of the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that one of the few silver linings from the pandemic is encapsulated in this phrase called essential workers. We didn't call them essential workers before. And I think there's new appreciation for the role of people who they may not have a lot of education and we may think of the jobs as being low skill, but how essential they are, the people who work in long-term care facilities, the people who staff the grocery stores, the people who drive the delivery trucks. And I do hope that that lingers. Some of it's going to show up in higher pay, but some of it has to do with respect for and appreciation for the work they do. And I think that may be a lasting, I hope it's a lasting
I think that's a
consequence.
great point. Great point. Well, we've unfortunately gotten to the point where we only have time for one more question. David, we could continue this all day. So I want to go back a little bit to the book and ask you a question around, this is a topic that I'm sure you wouldn't have thought you would have been writing about 3 or 4 years ago, but you wrote a very interesting book that not only lays out some important learnings from policy and politics, but also is entertaining to read and fun. So, what did you learn, sort of, as you explored this, that we all ought to take away from this experiment?
I learned that if you have a lot of money and you hire the right people, you can get something written into the law without a lot of scrutiny. And while I appreciate the motives of Sean Parker, I don't think that's the way we should make policy. Secondly, I learned, which I should have known, is there is an enormous industry of people who make their living by helping rich people save money on their taxes by exploiting every weakness in the tax code. Um, and that's just a fact of life. And it's one that we need to keep in mind. And third, despite those two cynical negative views, um, there are people out there, not enough of them, who really are trying to figure out how to make communities better and are taking advantage of programs like this. And if only we could devise a program that had more of them and less of the office buildings, hotels, and condos, then I wouldn't have written the book.
That's great. Good learnings. And I hope, and I share your view that there is an opportunity to have more of those folks, because we have many places in this country that need the kind of investment that Opportunity Zones were hopefully doing. And that was true before the pandemic, and it's certainly true now. So listen, thank you for spending the time. Our thanks to David Wessel for joining us today and discussing his new book, Only the Rich Can Play: How Washington Works in the New Gilded Age. You can purchase it online, better yet, at your favorite local bookstore and through the Commonwealth Club site. We'd also like to thank our audience for watching and participating live, and for those of you who watch this after we post it on the club's website. If you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's effort, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Lenny Mendonca. Thank you. Stay safe and healthy. And thank you again, David. Enjoy your day in Washington.
Thank you.